My parents' what was a meticulously crafted weapon, and I was its first victim. At 26, I had built a life for myself as a structural engineer, a career forged in the fires of my own determination after they had refused to pay a single cent of my college tuition. Their infamous reasoning, "You're smart enough to figure it out yourself," was a scar on my soul. I did figure it out through loans, 2 jobs, and a diet of instant noodles, graduating with honors and a mountain of debt. My younger brother, Eddie, now 18, was the polar opposite. Coddled, sheltered, and academically average, he was the golden child for whom the rules were always different. He got a car for his 16th birthday. I got a lecture on financial responsibility. He had his college applications handheld by our parents. I had navigated that maze alone. The bitterness was a low, constant hum in the background of my life. The call came on a Tuesday evening. It was my mother, her voice strained. "Your father, there's been an accident. A fall down the stairs. He's in the ICU. It's bad." A cold dread, entirely separate from any filial concern, trickled down my spine. My father was a vigorous, almost obsessively healthy man. A fall? It seemed improbable. I drove to the hospital through a haze of conflicting emotions, a son's worry warring with a lifetime of resentment. The scene in the waiting room was a study in contrasts. My mother, Eleanor, was a portrait of devastated grace, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, her composure eerily intact. Eddie was a mess, pale and shaking, his eyes red-rimmed. He couldn't look at me. "The doctors say it's a severe traumatic brain injury," my mother whispered. "They don't know if he'll wake up." I put a stiff arm around her, my engineer's mind already picking at the inconsistencies. Which stairs? The grand, sweeping staircase in our family home had a sturdy, well-maintained banister. My father, a former athlete, had the balance of cat. Days bled into a tense vigil. The police investigated, but it was initially ruled a tragic accident. My father, they speculated, must have tripped in the dark. I tried to voice my doubts to my mother. "It just doesn't feel right," I said, watching her closely. She gave me a look of pure, wounded grief. "How can you say that? Are you suggesting someone pushed him?" Her voice broke on a last word, and I immediately felt like a monster. Eddie flinched as if struck. It was during the second week, while my father clung to life in a medically induced coma, that my mother dropped the second bombshell. We were in the hospital cafeteria, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and despair. "The lawyers read the will," she said, her voice low and steady. "There's a dynamic clause." She explained that my father, a self-made millionaire from a shrewd tech investment in his youth, had always been paranoid about our entitlement. The will stated that if he were to die under suspicious or unnatural circumstances, the entire estate, a fortune worth tens of millions, would not be split equally. Instead, it would be awarded in its entirety to the child who could prove themselves most loyal to the family legacy and, more importantly, who could prove they were not involved in his death. The air left my lungs. "He thought one of us would kill him." I hissed, my voice a low whisper. "Not kill him," my mother corrected quickly, a strange glint in her eye. "But he wanted to ensure that no one would ever have a motive to hasten his departure. He called it the vulture clause. It was his way of protecting us from ourselves. It was the most twisted, paranoid thing I had ever heard, and it immediately cast a pall of suspicion over everyone in the room. Eddie looked like he was going to be sick. I felt a cold fury. Even from his hospital bed, my father was manipulating us, pitting us against each other from beyond the expected grave. That night, I went to my parents' house to pick up some clothes for my mother. The place felt alien, haunted by the ghost of my father's distrust. I found myself standing at the top of the infamous staircase, looking down. My eyes caught a tiny, almost imperceptible shimmer on the dark wooden floor of the landing. I knelt down. It was a sliver of transparent tape, sticky side up with a few tiny, gritty crystals stuck to it. It looked like someone had tried to tape something across the top of the stairs and then hastily removed it, leaving this one forgotten fragment. My blood ran cold. This was no accident. I pocketed the tape, my heart hammering. The vulture clause was no longer a morbid hypothetical. It was an active crime scene, and I was a prime suspect. My mind raced. Who stood to gain? Under the normal will, Eddie and I would have split the fortune. Under this clause, one of us got everything. The motive was clear, staggering, and terrifying. I began my own investigation, a dangerous game where the suspects were my own family. I avoided my mother and Eddie, telling them I was swamped with work. Instead, I started digging. I remember my father mentioning, in one of his rare moments of technological paranoia, that he kept a hidden backup of the security camera footage from the house on a private, encrypted server separate from the cloud storage the police had already checked. He didn't trust the cloud. He'd given me the access codes years ago. In case something happens to me, he'd said, and I dismissed it as another of his eccentricities. Using the codes, I managed to access the server. The footage from a night of the accident was there. My hands trembled as I clicked play. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. The camera in the hallway showed my father coming out of his study, looking tired. He walked towards the stairs. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows of Eddie's room. It was Eddie. He said something to my father. An argument ensued, though the cameras had no audio. My father's face was contorted in anger. He pointed a finger at Eddie, who took a step back, his own expression shifting from defiance to something else, fear, then a terrifying, cold resolve. My father turned to descend stairs. As he took the first step, Eddie lunged forward. It wasn't a push. It was a sharp, deliberate shove to the small of his back. My father flailed, his balance utterly compromised, and then he pitched forward, his body tumbling down the long, hard flight of stairs in a sickening series of thuds. He lay still at the bottom. Eddie stood at the top, frozen for a full minute, staring down, his face a mask of horror and shock. Then, he turned and fled back into his room. I sat back, my entire world shattering. Eddie, my little brother, the one they coddled and protected. He had killed our father. The motive was still unclear, but the act was undeniable. The vulture clause now made a horrific kind of sense. If my father suspected Eddie was capable of something like this, or if he simply wanted to create a scenario where the guilty party would reveal themselves, he had succeeded beyond his darkest dreams. But why would Eddie do it? He was the favorite. He stood to inherit millions under the normal will. It made no sense. I kept digging through the server files, looking for anything, emails, documents. I found a folder labeled Ian Scordettes. Inside were spreadsheets, screenshots of emails. My blood ran cold as I pieced it together. Eddie, my sheltered, spoiled brother, had a secret gambling addiction. He had accrued massive debts, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to some very dangerous people. He had been embezzling money from my father's accounts for months, but the sums had grown too large to hide. My father had discovered it that very night. The argument on the camera was the confrontation. To avoid exposure and, likely, a brutal reprisal from his creditors, Eddie had chosen the most permanent of solutions. I was torn. This was my brother, the kid I'd taught to ride a bike. But he was also a killer who had framed this entire situation to look like an accident, and who, by the terms of the will, now had a multi-million-dollar motive to ensure I was implicated. The piece of tape I found was his doing, a clumsy, last-minute attempt to make the fall look like a premeditated trap set by someone else, probably me. He was trying to activate the vulture clause in his favor. I decided to confront him. I arranged to meet him at my apartment, away from our mother. When he arrived, he looked gaunt, his eyes hollow. "I know what you did, Eddie," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. He stared at me, and for a second I saw the panic in his eyes. Then it was replaced by a shocking coldness. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're just trying to frame me because of the will. You've always been jealous. I have the footage, Eddie, from Dad's private server. I saw you push him. The mask crumbled. He sank onto my couch, his head in his hands. You don't understand. He was going to cut me off, disown me. Those men, they were going to kill me. So you killed him instead?" I roared, the fury finally breaking through. "Our father. It was an accident," he sobbed, the lie pathetic and transparent. "We argued. He lost his balance. I saw the shove, Eddie. It was deliberate. And the tape on the stairs? That was a nice touch. Trying to make it look like I rigged a tripwire." He looked up, his eyes wide with a new kind of fear. He hadn't known I'd found the tape. I had him. I told him he had one chance, to go to the police and confess to manslaughter. I would speak on his behalf, talk about the debt, the pressure. It was the only way to avoid a murder charge and to maybe, someday, salvage a shred of his soul. He seemed to consider it, his body shaking with silent sobs. Then he looked at me, and his eyes hardened into something I didn't recognize. "No, you'll delete that footage. You'll tell Mom and the lawyers that you believe it was an accident. You'll renounce any claim to the estate." "Or what?" I asked, incredulous. "Or I'll tell them you did it. That we argued about the tuition, about how they always favored me. That you threatened him. I'll say I found the tape and that it had your fingerprints on it. I'll say I saw you at the top of the stairs with him. Who do you think they'll believe? The resentful, angry son who they never helped? Or their golden boy?" The audacity of it left me speechless. He was going to frame me for patricide. The vulture claws was his weapon, and he was wielding it with brutal precision. In that moment, the last vestiges of brotherly love I had for him evaporated. "Get out," I whispered, my voice dangerously calm. He stood up, a smug, ugly twist his mouth. "Think about it, brother. You have until the reading of the will tomorrow. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I was trapped. If I went to the police with the footage, Eddie would enact his plan, and I'd be the prime suspect. My father's paranoid clause would ensure I was not only disinherited, but likely imprisoned. If I did nothing, a murderer would inherit everything, and I would live the rest of my life under a cloud of suspicion, knowing my brother had gotten away with it. I made my choice. I went to the law firm handling the estate before the formal reading. I asked to speak with the senior partner, Mr. Yates, alone. I laid it all out. The debts, the confrontation, the footage, Eddie's threat. I gave him a copy of the key piece of footage. I was not seeking to inherit. I was seeking to survive. The formal reading of the will was a macabre affair in Mr. Yates's oak-paneled office. My mother, dressed in black, sat poised. Eddie sat next to her, shooting me glances of pure, unadulterated hatred. Mr. Yates began to read the standard will. Then he paused. "However," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "as per the dynamic clause, and following a preliminary review of evidence submitted to this firm, the conditions for its activation have been met. The death of Arthur James was not an accident." My mother gasped. Eddie's face went white. "Therefore," Mr. Yates continued, putting on his glasses, "the entire estate, all assets and holdings, are bequeathed to the party who can be cleared of any involvement and who acted to uphold the truth." He looked directly at me, then at Eddie. "Based on video evidence and a documented confession of motive via threat, the estate passes in its entirety to—" Eddie stood up, his chair screeching. "He's lying. He manipulated the footage. He's doing this for the money." Mr. Yates remained impassive. "The evidence is incontrovertible, Edward. The police are waiting outside." The door opened. Two detectives entered. Eddie looked from them, to me, to our mother, who was staring at him with a dawning, horrific comprehension. The betrayal in her eyes was absolute. "It was you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "All this time, I defended you." Eddie broke. He started screaming, a raw, incoherent sound of rage and despair, as the detectives led him away in handcuffs, charging him with the murder of our father. In the end, I inherited the fortune I never wanted. The money felt like blood money, tainted by the tragedy and betrayal that had procured it. My relationship with my mother was irreparably broken. She retreated into a world of grief and guilt, unable to look at me, the living reminder of her golden child's monstrosity and her own flawed judgment. Eddie was convicted of second-degree murder. The footage and his financial records sealed his fate. I visited him once in prison. He was a hollowed-out version of the boy I once knew, consumed by bitterness. He told me I had won. I didn't reply. There were no winners here. I used the majority of the inheritance to establish a foundation for addiction support and grief counseling, a futile attempt to scrub some meaning from the carnage. I kept my job, my apartment, the life I had built with my own hands. The wealth was a fortress around me, but it was a cold, empty fortress built on the ruins of my family. My father's final, paranoid lesson was that trust is the most expensive currency of all, and in our family, it had cost us everything.